Good morning and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Mustafa Akyol and I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, focusing on the intersection of Islam, modernity, and public policy. And today I'm happy to moderate this forum on the new book, Islam and Statecraft, authored by my colleague, Jon Hoffman. We will hear more about the book from Jon in a few minutes, but in the beginning, let me say that it's a quite insightful and informative book, and is highly recommended for anyone interested in the politics of the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. Copies are out there if you want to grab one. It has many angles, I think, and one of which is, I think, the nuance that we need on this much-used term, political Islam. That term, widely used in the public discourse, often implies that there are certain political actors in the Middle East who use Islam as a source of leverage, as a discourse for a political agenda, for a political goal, and they're typically thought as the opposition groups. Some are just political, others could be militant, and that's what people think of political Islam. However, many governments in the region also do use Islam for their political goals, not to foster opposition for sure, but to preach obedience. That is why it may be more meaningful to speak about the politics of Islam instead of political Islam. As scholar Muhammad Ayatullahi Tabar has argued, and Jon, I think, agrees with that, and he demonstrates eruditely, I think, in the book. So, on our panel today, we will hear from Jon a summary of the key ideas in his book and how the politics of Islam work in the Middle East, in particular the Arab Gulf states, as he focuses on the book. Jon is a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute, focusing on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East geopolitics. His work has been featured in Foreign Policy, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, MSNBC, and other prominent media outlets. He holds a PhD in political science studies from George Mason University. Then we will hear a commentary about his work, his book, and his arguments from two expert scholars. First, from Annelle Sheline, whom we are delighted to host at Cato today. Annelle is a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She previously served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. She has written for Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, The New Republic, and appeared in many prominent news channels. She holds a PhD in political science from George Washington University and is currently completing a book manuscript on religious authority in the Middle East. After that, we hope to hear from Peter Mandeville, who's going to join us this morning. He's a little bit late, as he said, for some important meeting he couldn't delay. But now we will begin with Jon. So, Jon, congratulations for the book. I read it, underlining with a lot of intention. It's good work, really. And please give us some basic ideas, and then let's continue with that. And after these talks, we'll be happy to hear your questions and from the audience here, as well as people who are watching us online, who can share their questions through Slido, and I'll be happy to look into those questions as well.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Mustafa, and thank you, Annelle, for being here, and thank you all for being here. And Peter, who will be showing up. Peter was my dissertation chair who oversaw this project, so he probably knows it better than anybody else. So a broad overview of the book. The book really looks at the intersection of religion, international relations, and foreign policy. And this is still all around us today. Religion has been used to justify imperialism, transnational terrorism, foster peace, encourage liberation, discourage dissent, and so on. And what I'm interested in specifically with this book is how religion is mobilized as a tool of foreign policy. There's been a lot of focus over the past couple decades, particularly after 9/11, on the relationship between religion and international politics, or international relations theory, but the relationship between religion and foreign policy is still pretty under-examined. And where this topic is addressed, most analyses tend to approach the topic in a rather linear manner. It seeks to see how religion influences political outcomes. I flip this around in the book, and I ask, how do political considerations influence religious outcomes? Specifically, how religion is used as a tool of statecraft. I'm particularly interested in how religion is used as a tool of, as a form of soft power, what's often referred to as religious soft power. I try to build a framework for this concept in the book. Soft power is the ability to coerce, to co-opt, whereas hard power is the ability to coerce. Ultimately, what I argue in the book is that states appropriate, and when absent, construct their own, different religious doctrines and narratives, histories and symbols, according to the particular threats that they're facing in any given context and the audience that they're trying to influence. So I apply this framework to the Middle East and to Islam specifically. Why did I choose the Middle East and Islam? I chose the Middle East not just because it's my area of focus or that Islam is my own religion, but because of the widespread prevalence of what you can call essentialist or orientalist frameworks that still really permeate academic and policy circles when talking about the region. Central to this strand of thought are stereotypes surrounding Islam, or the idea that Islam is unique in the way that it relates to politics. And this is something that I try to challenge in the book. My good friend Shadi Hamid makes the other argument, and we've gone back and forth about this. But ultimately, what I'm looking at is the struggles for religious political authority within Islam. And these struggles, this competition, is almost as old as the religion itself. There are many competing claims to authority within Islam. The Quran did not specify a particular type of government, and there's no centralized religious hierarchy within Islam, particularly Sunni Islam, as there is in, say, Catholicism. Islam is a tremendously diverse tradition, historically and doctrinally. We often hear about Islam or Muslims as if their adherence to this religious tradition somehow masks the vast political, economic, and social differences that face the world's roughly 1.8 billion Muslims. What I'm concerned about in the book specifically is the state. Islam remains a very key tool of statecraft in the Middle East. Even nominally secular states in the Middle East often root their policies and try to justify them in an Islamic lexicon. But the state is not a neutral actor, right? It has its own interests, and over the past couple decades, the state has really, particularly in the Middle East, tried to bring religion more firmly under the control of the state. And granted, the state is not alone. It operates within a broader matrix of sub-state, non-state, and transnational actors, which can all influence the foreign policy decision-making of these states and can challenge the state's attempted monopoly on religion. What I look at is the struggle for religious political authority from the perspective of the state following the 2011 Arab uprisings. The Arab uprisings shook the Middle East to its core. It challenged the political, economic, and military elites who have ruled the Middle East for decades. The ramifications of the Middle East are still ongoing, and the grievances at the heart of them are still unaddressed, as I'll get to later. What ensued after the Arab uprisings was an intense struggle for political authority, and religion played a very key role in these competitions. To sketch out these competitions, I look at three cases in the book: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. I look at the Gulf specifically, one, because of the continued prevalence of religion, particularly in the Gulf, but the Gulf is where the real center of gravity of power in the Middle East has shifted. Traditional powers like Iraq and Syria and Egypt have taken a backseat for a number of reasons to the Gulf, but particularly because the Gulf is awash with money. Also, these cases really show the full spectrum of religious soft power strategies pursued by different states after the uprisings, not just how they vary between one another, but how they vary internally, how they vary according to the context in which these states were operating. So I want to briefly go through the three case studies. I won't bore you to death. Beginning with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is engaged in a very delicate balancing act when it comes to religion. On the one hand, they continue to embrace this very top-down, heavily traditionalist conceptualization of Islam that delegitimizes challenges to the prevailing status quo inside Saudi Arabia, given that Saudi Arabia did face opposition in the wake of the Arab uprisings, and across the wider Middle East. But again, this needs to be written with a little asterisk, because this varied when we look at, Syria, for example, early on when Saudi Arabia encouraged the uprisings, or in Riyadh's intervention in Yemen in 2015 when it used religion to justify its effort to uphold the government. But Riyadh really led the regional counter-revolution following the Arab uprisings to return the Middle East to the pre-Arab uprising status quo. But on the other hand, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has used religion to buttress his new hyper-nationalist project at home. Islam within Saudi Arabia has not been reformed per se. We often hear about this reforms happening in Saudi Arabia, and there are important social reforms happening. But when it comes to religion specifically, religion is more so being repurposed to support MBS's agenda to achieve ultimate authority domestically. Again, we see these several important social reforms, but at the same time, politics and religion remains under the strict control of Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman has amassed more power than any other figure in the history of Saudi Arabia. Additionally, Saudi Arabia has leaned into this so-called, quote-unquote, moderate Islam, projecting an image of moderation and progress to international audiences, which I'm going to save a discussion on that till a little bit here. But moving on to Qatar. Qatar encountered the Arab uprisings from a dramatically different perspective than Saudi Arabia or the UAE. There was really an absence of a pressing domestic threat to the Al Thani regime, and this allowed Qatar to be more external facing, giving them greater maneuverability than Saudi Arabia or the UAE. In several cases, Qatar sought to capitalize on the revolutions spanning the region by supporting Islamist movements, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood and its various offshoots, who, in the early days of the uprisings and after their early electoral successes, looked to be, critical new players shaping the region's future. But again, little asterisk is needed. This is not to say that Doha full-heartedly supported or embraced the revolutions. Qatar remains an autocratic government, and when the revolution spread to the Gulf, in Bahrain and Yemen specifically, this proved to be a little too close to home for the Al Thani. In both Bahrain and Yemen, Qatar joined with Saudi Arabia in the UAE to prevent policy change and to denounce what they framed as Iranian encroachment. These two cases notwithstanding, Qatar's strategy on trying to capitalize on elements of the uprisings was pretty short-lived, as counter-revolutionary forces quickly consolidated their power and swept across the region. Qatar found itself forced into a more defensive posture, particularly after the 2017 Gulf crisis, and its strategy was very limited. But these networks still remain and can be easily re-upped if, or really when, the region witnesses more upheavals. Lastly, the UAE. Like Saudi Arabia, the UAE has focused primarily on delegitimizing political activism and promoting obedience to established authority. The UAE, along with Saudi, was leading the regional counter-revolution in the Middle East, and it bankrolled much of the efforts to squash the uprisings. But their main focus, insofar as religion is concerned, has been on their messaging towards the West, namely projecting an image of tolerance, moderation, and progress towards, in particular, the United States, who remains Saudi Arabia's security the UAE's security guarantor. They are the case par excellence of this so-called government-sponsored project of moderate Islam. What is this moderate Islam? And I put quotes around it. At its core, the project promotes a politically quietist and statist conceptualization of Islam. It stresses absolute obedience to established authority. It renders religion subservient to the state while delegitimizing alternative sources of religious political authority. This is often coupled with what can be termed the strategic usage of interfaith tolerance, in many cases to promote this image of moderation and progress, to deflect attention away from their own repressive and destabilizing policies. For the UAE, the real crown jewel of this is the so-called Abraham Accords, the series of normalization agreements between Israel and a series of Arab states. But as myself and others have argued, despite depicting the Accords as a inherently religious initiative, I would argue, and many have argued, that they have far more to do with politics than piety. I want to use that as a springboard to conclude with a discussion on the policy angle of all of this. This is what I'm paid to do here at Cato, and I don't want to bore everybody to death with going into the weeds about the book. Of particular importance from a policy perspective is this government-sponsored project of moderate Islam, specifically because it's been embraced by the West and the United States. But behind this project of moderate Islam, and I'm not saying that the entire project is bad, but are these Arab autocrats. And at the heart of this project is depicting any and all forms of political opposition as manifestations of radicalism or extremism. It depicts the problems in the Middle East, plaguing the Middle East, as inherently religious in nature, and segments the region into two broad buckets, what Mahmoud Mamdani referred to shortly after 9/11 as good Muslims and bad Muslims. If that sounds wildly Orientalist, that's because it is. A key argument that I make in the book is that Arab autocrats often engage in what I call reverse Orientalism, projecting stereotypes about Islam back at the West to present themselves as the best, perhaps only, guarantor of stability in the Middle East. By keeping conversations centered on the supposed deficiencies of the people of the Middle East or of Islam, these autocrats are able to deflect attention away from their authoritarian policies, and which are often the underlying catalysts for regional instability. Such thinking about Islam in the region is central to what's often termed the myth of authoritarian stability that underpins U.S. Middle East policy. And this is the idea that select autocrats are the best guarantors of U.S. strategic interests. But I argue, and I think my colleagues flanking me on the left and right would also argue, that this account has things backwards. Rather than being a solution to the region's problems, these actors and the broader illiberal order propped up by the United States is the most profound source of regional instability. The greatest divide within the Middle East, in my opinion, has never been between pro or anti-West, Sunni or Shia, Arab or Israeli, secular or religious, but rather this gaping chasm that exists between these governments and the people that they rule over. Trying to segue also into the situation that we face in the Middle East today. The Middle East is incredibly unstable right now. Israel's war in Gaza, launched after Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th, has decimated the Strip while pushing the region to the brink of full-scale war. Washington's decision to bankroll this war has generated tremendous outrage against the United States throughout not only the Middle East, but the broader Muslim community. My colleague Mustafa noted early on in this conflict that this undermines more liberal and reform-minded voices within Islam and fuels hardliners who point to Western hypocrisy or indifference to the region's suffering as examples, by which to recruit. Coupled with this is the fact that the root causes of the Arab uprisings continue to get worse by the day. We saw in Syria that these grievances still have the ability to overthrow governments, regardless of what one thinks of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which took power. So the road for the region is turbulent, to say the least, but I would say that religion will continue to be used and abused as part of these conflicts by different actors with their own unique interests. But I hope that this book and the work of scholars like Annelle and Mustafa and Peter, who's still MIA, will help lead to a more productive U.S. Middle East policy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. That was lots of things.
There are lots.
Very well explained in 20 minutes, and opened some important questions, which I will actually come myself.
Okay.
But now I would love to hear from Annelle about her thoughts about this book and the general topic. I mean, she's an also expert in the Middle East and the issue of Islam and politics in the region. Yeah.
Well,
thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. And first, I just want to commend John on writing so forcefully and compellingly on a topic that I also grapple with and often struggle to convey with such clarity. So I'm really grateful to have this book, as my long-delayed book is struggling to come into the world. So first, John had asked me if I could talk a little bit about the policy background, and I know Peter has, Peter, I anticipate, will have a lot more to say about this. But one thing I did want to acknowledge, and part of what I observed during my time at the State Department, so I was in the part of the State Department that focuses on human rights, and under that rubric is the office that focuses on international religious freedom. So that's separate from what I was doing, but it is related. And one thing that I not only observed at State, but also prior to that doing my dissertation fieldwork on this question of moderate Islam, is the irony of the fact that the US government supports these authoritarian regimes in ways that are directly counterproductive to religious freedom. And this has to do in some ways because of the ways the US government tends to define religious freedom, which tends to focus more on the treatment of religious minorities, rather than the dynamics that John has described, which are much more widespread, impact many more people, which is the ways that states restrict what is permitted to be a legitimate expression of Islam as only this sort of statist, quietist, sort of anti-revolutionary conception of Islam, which itself is in some ways extremely limiting. And as John has pointed out, this question of, many of the people advocating for democracy in the Middle East tend to be the Islamists, who know that if there were to be actual democratic governments or political reforms in their countries, they would be likely to win. And this is part of what we observed in the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, and part of why you then saw this counter-revolution, this reaction from many of these governments against groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, which up until that point, in certain contexts, was considered moderate. In Jordan, for example, where I did field work, it was seen as sort of a loyal opposition, whereas in more recent years, it is now characterized as problematic and potentially extremist. So in many ways, I think the root of why that's possible, this sort of irony in the way the US government misconceives of what religious freedom actually would be, and in many ways would support what the US government has long claimed to support, which is democratization in the rest of the world, has to do, I think the root of that is Islamophobia and this lack of understanding of Islam, which unfortunately was not addressed in the aftermath of 9/11, and which I would argue has contributed to why the United States and why Europe, have been willing to go along with what Israel is doing to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I do think that Israel has been able to benefit from pernicious Islamophobia, which has really never been addressed, in particular in this country and also in Europe. One question I wanted to discuss was the Saudi puzzle. I do think, given Saudi Arabia's stature as a source of religious authority in the Muslim community, is this question that, historically there have been previous times when Saudi rulers tried to reform Islam or tried to change Saudi society. You think of, for example, King Faisal in the 1960s introduced education for girls and television. And this was huge at the time and precipitated a lot of backlash, such that even one of his own nephews, who was involved in an attack on a television station, was killed by a policeman. And then that nephew's brother killed King Faisal 10 years later in retaliation. So this just signals sort of the level of both repression that the Saudi state was involved in trying to prevent this conservative backlash against, what I think you and I would agree girls' education is positive in general for Saudi society, but the way that it was implemented did create a lot of backlash. You also had the Sahwa movement, the Islamic awakening, that came to a head in particular in the 90s, but had been involved, or had been manifesting prior to that. And a big aspect of the Sahwa movement, of this push for greater Islamization within Saudi society and a greater role for clerics, was the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the Gulf War. And we know that it was that presence of US troops that was a key factor radicalizing bin Laden, who had offered his services to the Saudi state. He was rebuffed. He ended up, we know what happened. So it's not only the fact that we haven't seen this sort of conservative backlash to what MBS has been doing, and so that's a question for both of you, and I hope for Peter, who knows Saudi Arabia well, why we haven't seen more of a backlash. And I think another aspect that I did want to bring up had to do, in particular, with the question of democracy. I certainly agree with you that these autocratic governments benefit by saying that, by playing on American fears of this notion that if democracy were to be introduced to this part of the world, the scary Islamists would win. So it certainly serves their interest to be anti-democratic. At the same time, I'd like you and the rest of the panel to engage with this question of readiness for democracy, because you do think of things, for example, like the democratic development that occurred in Tunisia, the only democracy to emerge from the Arab Spring, and its subsequent erosion, collapse. You could argue Tunisia is no longer democratic. And largely this does reflect the fact that democracy really wasn't able to deliver for people in ways that had a significant impact on their quality of life, and does again speak to sort of the shallowness of how the US government tends to think of democracy, which is simply reflected by the presence of elections, competitive elections. So this question of, well, what else would democracy entail? And I again agree with your general point that this notion that the region is not ready for democracy serves the autocrats, but what do you think would be needed beyond just elections themselves? One final point would be to take the timeline back just a bit. I know that you focus, understandably, on the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, but I do think that thinking about the aftermath of 9/11 and the birth of this sort of moderate Islam narrative that came out of that, we know that the Bush administration initially saw the answer to terrorism as democratize the region. I mean, this was the justification of one of several justifications given over time for the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And we know that, it wasn't only the Gulf countries that introduced this language of moderate Islam, but Pervez Musharraf of Pakistan, for example, wrote this very famous piece in the context of the invasion of Iraq, where he was trumpeting this notion of moderate Islam, I think because he was worried that the US might have been about to go after Pakistan, which arguably, for historians of the war in Afghanistan, might have argued, yeah, that would have been useful militarily. So just to consider sort of backing up a little further, this conception of moderate Islam as a reaction to 9/11, and even further beyond that, thinking about how moderate Islam had long been understood as a willingness to accept the presence of the State of Israel as well, and how that has also, again, become much more salient in our current moment.
Yeah, see, this is why I invited you. These are great questions. First on the Saudi part, and when Peter gets here, I know he'll have a lot to say about Saudi Arabia too, because he writes on it constantly. I think when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I would, first, just if anybody's looking for a direction on resources, Madawi al-Rashid's work on Saudi Arabia and the transformations happening in Saudi Arabia is unparalleled. And what she really gets at is this new project within Saudi Arabia to make Saudi Arabian citizens feel like Saudi citizens. You know, this idea of, rooting the identity of people within Saudi Arabia, not solely within Islam as it has been historically, but in what it actually means to be Saudi. So this is the nationalist project that I'm talking about that Mohammed bin Salman is spearheading. And this is directed primarily at the youth in Saudi Arabia. So more than 50% of the population is below the age of 30. So it's an incredibly young population. And I think this is the paradox of Mohammed bin Salman as the reformer prince, right? Like, we're seeing social reforms in Saudi Arabia, which are important. You mentioned the women's education and other reforms, but today we're seeing women being allowed to drive, cinemas, concerts, other things which are good. These are good social reforms. But at the same time, and this is the paradox, we see politics, economics, and society being so centralized within Saudi Arabia under one individual, which is rather unprecedented in the history of this country, even though it's been autocratic its entire existence. And that one individual is Mohammed bin Salman. I forget who the scholar is. But it's in the book. The best way to think of it, and I wish I could take credit for this terminology, is they're defanging, not dethroning Wahhabism. So Wahhabism within Saudi Arabia, in and of itself, necessarily isn't being reformed. I think you and Christian Ulrichsen wrote a piece on this for the Baker Institute. And I think that really gets to the heart of it, is religion is being repurposed. It's being repurposed towards this nationalist project. It's being repurposed towards this moderate Islam project. And also it's being repurposed in Riyadh's engagement with other global powers such as Russia and China, which I get at in the book. But there's risks with this, right? So Saudi Arabia leaned heavily into religion during the Cold War, and we saw what happened from promoting this very puritanical vision of Islam.
With U.S. urging.
With U.S. urging.
Seen as a counter balance to communism.
Yeah, so we've seen how trying to utilize this can backfire. And I think the same risks exist with the nationalist project in Saudi Arabia. You can encourage forces beyond your control, especially if you fail to deliver on the economic promises like Vision 2030 and so on. You might risk being consumed by the very new foundation of which you're trying to promote if you become viewed as ineffective. This readiness for democracy, too, I think is really important, because there is pushed from Arab autocrats this message that the people of the Middle East are not ready for democracy. You need us to keep them in check, or you need us to advance American interests in the Middle East. And the case of Tunisia is really fascinating, as is, I think, also Turkey. Which, I'm not going to talk on because the person sitting to my left is 10 times more qualified. But I think the case of Tunisia and Ennahda in Tunisia is an interesting case, because you did have democracy, and you saw Ennahda engaging with secular parties. You saw Ennahda, kind of the epitome of what's often referred to as this post-Islamism, trying to play the game at the same time. And then the coup by Kais Saied sent the country back to a dictatorship. So it's that idea, like, are we ready? But I take a more skeptical position, because I think even in Tunisia, there were forces working against genuine attempts at economic reform, forces trying to maintain the status quo, both domestically and abroad. And I think, Tunisia is a fascinating case because it shows, like, even where you can get democratic advances, it can be overturned. And I think seeing Syria recently is the other way around. You can still have the overthrow of these governments through opposition by religious actors, in this case, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who's very different than Ennahda. But I wanted to, if you want to say some words about Turkey.
Sure. I'll get to Turkey. I'll say a few things on other points too. Well, there are a lot of things I agree with Jon, and I will mention one of those, and I will push back on one point.
Yeah.
Okay? First of all, I agree with you a lot on the critique of authoritarian rule in the name of Islam, which defines any opposition as illegitimate, right? Fitna, like discord in society, and defines any opposition and conflates with extremism. Today, there are some people in the Middle East who will say, what is extremism? Extremism is speaking out against the ruler. No, that is a political right, as far as I believe in, as late Ottoman scholars could tell you, or some other scholars today in the Middle East would tell you. Well, bombing places is extremism, killing people is obviously, so violence is extremism. But there's a tendency to conflate violence and opposition together, right? Mm-hmm. And that is wrong, and that should not be given a credit. I think that's the language of authoritarianism. It's unacceptable. Now, there's a nuance there, though. Some of the opposition groups have turned extremist at times. They had extremist offshoots. I think the typical example is the Muslim Brotherhood here. It's been a nonviolent religious political movement from 1920s onwards. At times, offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt took a harder line and engaged in terrorist violence. Now, this in return is used to say, look, you see, they have a potential to be terrorists, so we should suppress them. So let's suppress them so they don't become terrorists, becomes the kind of vicious argument. Or maybe they become terrorists when you suppress them, is the other way of looking around. And this is not just about Islam. Like, I'm being from Turkey.
Yeah.
Turkey doesn't have a problem with religious-based violence that much. I mean, we had maybe few extreme, very small groups. But in Turkey, when you ask about terrorism, they will think about the PKK. The Kurdish separatist movement, right? Which is at war with the government since 1984. Luckily, these days, the leader of the PKK announced that it's amazing.
Yesterday.
So that's in the midst of all the terrible news from the Middle East.
For this event specifically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they wanted to give us some good spirit here. The jail leader of the PKK, using his typical Marxist language, said that the time of real socialism has changed. He says he's calling for a farewell to arms. Now that's wonderful. I will take that as someone who argued for ending this conflict, which means that terrorism can end with negotiations, right? Not exterminating the terrorists as the hawks always want to do, but having some channels of dialogue, which we've seen between IRA and the UK government, which we've seen in the Philippines between the Filipino Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Filipino government, ended peacefully with a political agreement. But anyway, for decades, PKK has been a terrorist group in the sense that it had a guerrilla army attacking the soldiers and the military, and sometimes attacking civilians, which is the specific definition of terrorism I would use. So the Turkish hawks, Turkish nationalist hawks, said, you see, they're terrorists, so we should suppress any Kurdish movement. Ultimately, it leads to the PKK. But when you look at the history, the PKK emerged because peaceful Kurdish movements, political, maybe too ambitious, but they were banned in the first place. So that's the vicious cycle of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism creates the very demons that it is fighting against. And sometimes, yes, they are demons. There are fanatic groups which attack people, so it's wrong. Or occupation might be creating the very demon it is fighting, which is terrorism, and maybe the problem is to end the occupation, have a two-state solution, having in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you referred to. So there I agree a lot. One more thing though, here's a pushback a little bit. In the book, you go through examples of this moderate Islam, stances, and so I myself don't use the term moderate Islam, but I've used terms like Islamic liberalism or more democratic understanding of politics in the Islamic tradition. I would say some of the things still done in that framework are not wrong, and actually they might be helpful in and of themselves. For example, you in the book mentioned the Marrakesh Declaration in 2017. I read the Marrakesh Declaration. I'm actually working on an article on it. That's a good declaration. It's about the rights of non-Muslim minorities in Muslim-majority countries. The scholars, I think, who signed this did a good job in referring to Prophet Muhammad's Charter of Medina, which gave a pluralistic, format to Medina, said to Jews their religion, to Muslims their religion. They take inspiration for that to argue for a more pluralistic understanding of Islam today. So I will take that, and I think that is good in itself. So I would have other problems with the government who's supporting that on their political stances. But sometimes there are issues in Islam to work on, and some of the modern Islam approach you criticize, although it might be falling short of political freedom, it might be advocating for more religious freedom. That might be okay. That might be good in itself. Or regarding Saudi Arabia, the much I'm glad that Saudi women can drive today. So that is a good thing in itself. I'm not glad that people who tweet against the government, go to jail for decades and decades. So that is a burning problem, and I will not justify that by looking at this. But wherever we have a progress of freedom, human rights, in the political, cultural, religious sphere, we can appreciate it as what it is, but we can also look whether this is just cosmetic or not, which is the problem here, if there is one, I think. At least one of the two problems. Sometimes it's just cosmetic to show to the Western audiences, you see, we're very nice, we're doing this, but what about the people in your jails? And so to justify that is the problem. And the second one, of course, in the Middle East and in Turkey, in my country, going back to Turkey, Atatürk, the Shah of Iran, we have this image of the autocratic modernizer who comes and who looks at his people and he says, I am giving you modernity. Now all women had to take the headscarves off. I'm telling them by command. Well, this has not worked. It backfires. What you need to do is, it comes as a top-down project. It is illiberal in itself, right? And while it might be doing, some things might be okay, like equal rights for women is definitely good, but to coerce them, for example, to take the hijab off, as it happened in Iran in the Shah era, in the first Shah, in Turkey in the 90s. So that autocratic modernization is not a promising concept. And I think I see the glimpses of that argument in your book, and I agree a lot with that. Which doesn't mean, I think, there are no issues to discuss in Islam today with regards to women's rights, religious freedom, freedom of expression, blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, legal equality, inequality. There are a lot of issues to discuss, and some of the scholarship in the countries you mentioned may be heading towards the right direction. I'll take that and appreciate it. I will not oppose that. But I'll be very skeptical of also justifying political authoritarianism because of some good steps taken in other directions. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, I think what you highlight is really important, because nobody's going to look at the Marrakesh Declaration, that preaches minority rights, and be like, wow, we don't need this. No, it's still important. What I try to highlight in the book, and religious tolerance, religious engagement, interfaith engagement, all these things should be encouraged. But what I try to highlight in the book is, look at the political hand that also exists off to the side over here. And when many of these initiatives are being put forward, a lot of times they're being put forward by countries who at the same time are preaching religious tolerance, preaching religious toleration, use religion as a tool of repression over here, specifically with their own people. And I think this overfixation on Islam in particular detracts from the real root causes of instability and unrest in the Middle East, which is the illiberal status quo. It's these governments that span the entire region. So while these are very important, women driving, minority rights, all of these things, and they should be, commended because these are productive advances. At the same time, we need to really look at the root causes of instability and conflict and unrest in the Middle East. And more often than not, it's this illiberal order. And
I'm glad you call it the illiberal order, by the way. Some people call it liberal order. I'm saying this is not a liberal order.
No, and you and I have had this conversation before, and I think it gets to like the last point, which I forgot to discuss that you mentioned, is we want to encourage these reforms and we want to encourage democracy and liberalism, but we don't want to go the complete polar opposite, George Bush, do this by invading and installing democracy. This can't be done by force. And I think that...
Or neither Gaza Riviera.
No, no. I think none of this can be achieved by force, whether it be Bush invading, installing, trying to install democracy, or reforms that are advanced by these governments that rely on coercion. So like the headscarf rule that you mentioned in Iran. So I think coercion here is the real thing that I'm trying to highlight. And
no wonder you're at Cato. You see coercion as the problem.
Yeah, we're very skeptical of the state here at Cato, if you couldn't pick up on my presentation. But this is something that I went over a lot with Peter when I was writing the book, was you can never know intentions. You can never say, this was done with X intention, but you can look at outcomes. You can look at how, on the one hand, many of these countries champion things like the Marrakesh Declaration, and on the other hand, are brutally repressive at home. That's just an outcome that you can look at. And then you can try and connect the dots here on how one is being used in tandem with the other. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in as well on this.
Yeah, I mean, just to highlight that, thinking of the Marrakesh Declaration, which I agree, not only speaks to sort of something so fundamental within Islamic history as the Charter of Medina, that the Prophet Muhammad, recognizing the rights of religious minorities, but the fact that it was put together by a grouping of scholars, but hosted by the King of Morocco in the city of Marrakesh in Morocco, and Morocco, treats Christians terribly, or it just does not allow them religious freedom. In particular, Moroccans who convert to Christianity or to any other religion. So it is this question of, to what extent are these declarations or these changes or so-called reforms superficial and cosmetic and directed at the West in ways that, again, kind of go back to that play into this kind of deep Islamophobia and also ignorance of Islam, not understanding that within Islam itself, the notion of wasatiyya, or the middle way, this is often what is translated like Islam al-Wasati, is sort of moderate Islam. And this is within the Quran, the notion that, the Prophet Muhammad himself criticized Christians for sometimes being too extreme. In particular, celibacy is required for priests. He, saw that as unnatural and thought that, in terms of being able to be a good Muslim, the best way was the middle way. And so for myself, when I, was looking at these questions in places like Jordan or Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Oman, so frequently I was engaging with members of the religious establishment or teachers or simply citizens, of these countries who felt they had to justify over and over again, Islam is not terrorism. And they thought that me as an American, this is the conception I was bringing. And I just found it so unfortunate that, we as a country, which in the aftermath of 9/11, until very recently, this question of terrorism has dominated our security agenda around the world, have not bothered to really understand more about a global religion that again has driven so much of our policy and led to so much death and destruction around the world, not only in our wars, but also just the counterterrorism presence and support, for direct financial military support to these governments that do continue to reinforce the kinds of suppression that do produce extremism. So I just wanted to highlight your point, Mustafa, about how, which comes first. Often it is the violence of the state directed at opposition that then, the only alternative is violence.
Opposition or to another society, another country, like an occupation or like invasion. Yeah.
That as well. So again, I think, one other point I wanted to make is sort of, it's frustrating as someone who studied this question of terrorism and to see for so long how sort of terrorism was depoliticized and it was not seen as legitimate to address, well, what are the grievances of these people we've painted as terrorists? Is there a way we could actually address their concerns such that they're no longer interested, they no longer have a motivation to engage in this violence? That was seen as completely illegitimate, and now we've just sort of moved on, and now we're doing great power competition. I do fear, in the context of Israel's war on Gaza and now the West Bank, an ongoing occupation, we will see terrorism. We will see acts of violence, politically motivated violence, reasserting themselves against Americans, and just as a this problem has not gone away, as Jon highlights so eloquently in the book.
Maybe we can say authoritarianism is not the cure to extremism. Freedom is the cure to extremism. Can I agree on that? Maybe. Okay. Good.
But I agree with Annelle that none of this really plays anymore. Everything is great power competition these days. If it's not Russia and China, people don't want to talk about it.
Well, that's important too, but this one too definitely. Well, thank you again. Well, now I have more questions, but I don't want to dominate the panel. And if Peter magically shows up, we will happy to have him. In the meantime, we are open now. We have time for questions from both online audience and in-person audience here. So if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. And I see a hand right there, two actually here. Do we have a microphone? Someone helping us with that? A microphone? I think someone will be coming. In the meantime, please speak clearly and directly into the microphone so everyone can hear you. And also, please first mention your name and affiliation. Thank you very much. Also, using the X hashtag Cato Events, people can write questions to us on Facebook, YouTube, and X as well.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service of the United States. I'd like to ask Dr. Hoffman why I never heard anything in your discussion of your book about Iran and Shia Islam. I'm wondering if that, apparently that was a deliberate decision you made, and I'm wondering why it was you did not mention Shia Islam as well and the country of Iran.
Yeah, so great question. So this project grew out of Muhammad Ayatollahi Tabar's book, Religious Statecraft, The Politics of Islam in Iran. So the framework that Muhammad Ayatollahi Tabar, and I work closely with him on this book.
He's not an Ayatollah himself, right?
No, it's just a name.
He could be.
Maybe.
Well, his family's pretty prominent, but we call him Muhammad Tabar.
So that need in the market, I think, was filled by that book. And so what I wanted to do was take and reorient his framework and build a different framework for religious soft power and look at it from intra-Sunni competition, because he looked at it from the perspective of Shia states in Iran. And in the book, there is a great deal that deals with Iran, particularly after the Arab uprisings, competition between Saudi and Iran, and how this plagued different arenas like Syria and Yemen, but in Bahrain. But for a very sellout answer is so he kind of wrote that book already. So I wanted to try and shift and look at the competition between Sunni Islam, specifically within the Gulf.
If you cover, you can write a second volume.
I'll write a second one. Yeah.
Shia Islam and the Persian,
I'll write it with Dr. Tabar.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir, for the question. We have another one there.
Hi, my name is Ashok Panika. I'm not an academic. I'm not a diplomat. but I have spent 40 years working at the grassroots level on issues related to democracy, collaborative decision making in communities. And after 40 years of doing this work, I have no faith in democracy at all, because under my watch, so to speak, India lost its democracy. And my question to you is, how can we continue to have faith in giving people the freedom to make their own decisions when it's been proven over and over again that particularly non-Western societies like mine are extraordinarily traditional, collectivist, hierarchical, and we instinctively we're not comfortable with the idea of egalitarianism. So in India, for instance, despite a much longer history of democracy compared to Tunisia, almost 70 years, we created the conditions where the Hindu right wing could completely take over the country. And I guess I'm at a place here where I'm trying to figure out how we can continue to ask for greater democracy in the developing world when most people are not ready for it. And I don't mean this in a white supremacist, Western supremacist way. It's just that the values of my people, and I've lived in the Arab world for about 12 years, our values are very different from the liberal, enlightenment-based European values. And in fact, particularly watching the way the West has developed over the past 20 to 40 years, the rest of the world, I don't want to broadly generalize, but many people, intelligent people in other parts of the world are terrified of the Western model because it's totally destructive of the family, of society, of community, of neighborhoods. So I have no answers, but I'm really wondering how, when we talk about democracy in Islam or freedom in Islam, how we can just presume that more of that will somehow not just prevent extremism, address the root cause of terrorism, and somehow somehow solve these problems. I'm just confused, so I'll leave it to.
No, that's fine. I thought I was pessimistic. Wow, you give me a run for my money, man. No, but I think you raise an important question. The first thing that I would say is no democracy is perfect. I mean, look at what's going on in the United States. Look what's happening in the West more generally. So,
if you look at Twitter, you can see no society is ready for democracy. Sorry.
No, so yeah, I understand your question, and I think, for me personally, more freedom is always the answer. And coercion, especially, efforts top down from the state, are probably the worst way we can go about things. But on the matter of freedom and Islam, I would be remiss if I didn't yield to you, since you're the leading expert on this.
No, I mean, thank you for that observation and that frustration. I partly share it too. I mean, the world is not in a great shape today in many parts of the world. I mean, there are a lot of concerning movements, political movements. And the one in India, as you mentioned, the Hindutva movement, that is winning elections. So electorally, it is a democracy, but it is certainly crushing many freedoms of minorities, Muslims and Christians in particular in India, and it's a growing threat. Now, one problem we see in particular India, my country Turkey, and in some other places, is democracy just being reduced to mere elections, competitive elections, and the winner of the elections can just do whatever it wants by violating the rights of other people, by controlling the judiciary, by growing and controlling the press, suffocating opposition, and establishing a majoritarian system, which is not freedom, right? So there's a tension between this majoritarian democracy and freedom, liberalism in the good classical sense of the term that I would defend here, as most of my colleagues at Cato. There is that problem. Also, in Western societies, there's one thing is people tend to be more liberal and open-minded when they feel secure. When they feel insecure, they tend to be oppressive. They tend to have, they want somebody to come and fix the problem by, with his hammer in his hand.
That's a good point, yeah.
And that is one reason, actually, the Middle East has not been democratizing well in the past 200 years. In the past 200 years, we've been trying to push many good ideas forward. There's been progress. But what happened? Colonization, bombs, wars, endless wars, Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli expansionism, Russian involvement, under so much chaos, right? People tend to not to have the most liberal attitude. They tilt towards extreme points of views. It could be extreme nationalism, we've seen. It could be religious extremism. And I'm telling to my friends in America, look, in America just felt a little bit threatened, a few things. I don't know, jobs going to China, and like very minor things compared to being bombed and occupied. Look, the visceral reaction it brought towards a more illiberal direction in politics in America on the, I think, different sides of the political spectrum. It's not an easy task, but to me, this is not. This doesn't lead me to have lose my faith in freedom. I don't have the faith that it's going to always prevail, but I have the faith that that's the right solution. Having more free political systems with less state imposition in societies, with more pluralism, with less threats, less violence. So that is still the goal. And in every society, it can take a different type. It doesn't have to be the copy of any 100% Western model. It doesn't have to be copying the latest narrative on US campuses on issues of race and gender, and you want to copycat in different parts of the world. But every society in its own dynamics, with references to its own traditions, religious and cultural traditions, can go towards a more tolerant, pluralistic, less coercive direction, or can go towards a dark direction. And I think in every society that battle has to be fought by people who try to go forward the better way. And one thing I think is needed is that to ask the question, would you want this for yourself if you were the minority? Like in India, India and Pakistan are two countries I'm watching very closely. In India, Muslims are persecuted, targeted by a Hindu majority, Hindutva, let's say militant nationalism. They want liberal values in India. I wrote a column on that with a colleague of ours at Cato, why Hindu Muslims reach out for liberalism. So Hindu Muslims see the value of a secular liberal constitution protecting their rights. Well, I want to tell Pakistani majoritarian Muslims, you see, that's why this is necessary. So don't be a mirror image of the Hindu militant nationalists that are advancing India against you by threatening the minorities here. So we need those conversations, we need those efforts, not because we have faith that democracy will always prevail, but we have a conviction that it's actually necessary. Democracy in the sense of freedom, political freedom.
Yeah, just to go off that, and I'm sure Annelle wants to weigh in too. When you look at polling across the Middle East as well, of course, polling is not an exact science, but there's overwhelming support for democracy in the Middle East across the board. And one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest barriers to democracy in the Middle East is the United States. I think that's, we can accept that as fact. The United States, prefers, we can talk about, Bush's freedom agenda and stuff like that, and to what extent it really sought to promote democracy. But the United States, by upholding this order in the Middle East, and the United States being the strongest state in the history of mankind, when it's upholding this order, and this order being the most profound source of insecurity, it does look like a very daunting task. But there are, like yourself, you said you worked 40 years on this, but there are many movements in the Middle East, civil society movements that are really trying. And there's, I've worked with some of them before. Some of them are based here in the West. I'm not sure if he's in the audience, but Radwan Masmoudi leads an organization on Tunisia, and they work on the ground constantly. There are these groups that exists. And I think if America's focus shifted more away from propping up autocrats to maybe recognizing these civil society groups that are trying to bring about democratic change, that might push the needle a little bit in a more preferred direction. But since you worked at DRL, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. government's efforts at democracy promotion have often not been particularly effective. But I think, to your excellent point, I do think that some of the ways that the way that democracy is conceptualized is very American and very European. And some of that does come out of the European experience, where you had countries that engaged in extreme levels of violence against ethnic minorities. You had this sort of creation of not always mono-ethnic, but efforts to establish a specific national identity within these European contexts as sort of the creation of the modern state. And then within that sort of a society where you have, again, part of it is repression, but also some buy-in to this notion of, I am a citizen of France, I am a citizen of Germany or the UK or whatever, then sort of within that kind of a society, it is more possible to engage in competitive elections, to sort of not be quite as fearful of sort of the ethnic other. And this is part of what we've seen in Europe, where the illiberal reaction, the rise of the right wing in Europe, as a response to this perceived ethnic other of, the result of like the refugee crisis, as a result of the Syrian civil war, for example. And so, I think again, to just try and highlight something Mustafa mentioned, that within so many societies, you do have, humans have known how to sort of manage our affairs throughout the world in ways that, obviously there have been a long history of conflict, but also long histories of coexistence. And that it's really only you start to see the rise of sort of ethnic tension and different ethnicities being a problem in this context of the modern state, and in particular when you do have elections and suddenly these notions of difference, which aren't limited. I mean, I use ethnicity to also refer to religion or sort of all of these ways that people group each other and view sort of differences. And so I think in many ways, because you do have so many parts of the world where they're not necessarily drawing on their own ways that this society has managed to coexist historically. I mean, you think about the fact that Hinduism and Islam have coexisted in India for 1,000 years, and though there certainly have been tensions throughout that period, but that they've really come to a head in this current context. So all that to say that I do think that in many ways, myself as an American, as someone sort of raised within our own understanding of what democracy is, and many Americans, and in particular, this was something I experienced on a daily basis at the State Department, is this unfortunate tendency towards sort of Western supremacy, American supremacy, the belief that the US model can simply be exported to the rest of the world, and an unwillingness to understand or learn more about how societies have managed their own affairs and managed these kinds of tensions, often in ways that were less violent and more productive throughout human history.
Thank you. And now we have another question that's coming online. Michael Miller, it's an interesting theoretical question. He says, if religion is made subordinate to the state, not to specific rulers, doesn't that open the state to liberalization? Like, isn't it a good thing to make religion subordinate to the state, he says? So that will lead to make the state more liberal. I mean, the question comes with a presumption that I don't fully share, but I can comment on that too, but
yeah, I'll because I know what you're going to say, so I'll leave that to you. But I think, and this is something I talk about in the book, in the context of Islam and bringing it under the authority of the state, you can talk about two types of Islam that exist at the state level: state Islam and what's often referred to as regime Islam. And state Islam is, what you would typically think about of a state religious establishment, the religious institutions, the religious clerics that work on behalf of the state, and so on and so forth. This is the official, state apparatus. Then there's regime Islam, and this is religion in the service of the particular ruler. And what we've seen in the Middle East over the past couple of decades is this balance is shifting, and regime Islam is what's gaining a lot of prominence here. So when I talk about it bringing Islam under the strict authority of the state, we have to ask, who's the state in the Middle East? In Saudi Arabia, it's Mohammed bin Salman. In the UAE, it's Mohammed bin Zayed. They are the state. These individuals, these regimes are all-encompassing. So I would be skeptical on whether bringing Islam more firmly under the control of the state in the Middle East, when the state is already firmly under the control of these individual rulers, would lead towards more liberalization. But I know what you're already going to say, so
Yeah.
if you want to... yeah.
Thanks for Mr. Miller for asking this question. I appreciate the question, but I don't fully agree with the premise, which seems to be religion is an illiberal force. It's a dangerous force. So if we make religion controlled by the state, that is by definition a good thing. So without religious influence, the state will be a nicer thing, probably. I think that's... Well, we tried that in the 20th century. We had secular states under Joseph Stalin, Mao, Khmer Rouge, Nazis. I mean, secularism isn't necessarily liberalism. I mean, in the Middle East, one of the most secular Arab regimes, probably the most one, was Bashar al-Assad's Syria, which has been the most savage, cruel, sadistically cruel dictatorship whose dungeons have been just recently exposed. Yeah, religion can be a problem when it's oppressive, but if you take religion out, the vacuum can be filled by fascism, can be filled by crazy nationalism, can be just a whimsical, tyrannical ruler who's not controlled by religion, but who does whatever he wants, who just doesn't want to be criticized and kills people who oppose him. So that's why the emphasis on and some of the people who say the region is not ready for democracy, what they mean is the people are too religious, right? I think a European could say that, but it's an American, it doesn't, America is a very religious country from the very beginning. Precisely, actually, that has helped freedom flourish in America because religion gave a civil society, framework.
Decentralized.
Yeah. And now the question is, of course, when a theocracy, a religiously enforcing state, a state that enforces a specific religion or sect is a problem, and it is there as a problem in parts of the Muslim world. You mentioned apostasy laws, if I'm wrong, like Christians, can someone convert to Christianity? In about a dozen Muslim countries, no, that's illegal because that's apostasy. There are issues like that, I think, in Islamic law that has to be worked on. I'm working on. But no, that's a problem. But it doesn't mean that take the religion out, then you have a secular, beautiful, it could be a secular dictatorship. So therefore, I think liberalization is the right goal. That means a limited state, human rights, built on a philosophy of natural rights, and religious traditions can contribute to it, like saying, Prophet Muhammad's pluralistic state in Medina, the Quranic precepts of no compulsion in religion. So every culture can find sources within. I'm sure Hinduism can bring roots, its more liberal roots into the discussion. But I think the key issue is freedom and rights and having equality under the law. Religion can be an obstacle. Socialism has been an obstacle. Fascism has been a huge obstacle. And so there's no guarantee that subduing religion is a good solution. Also, religion can even be a good force standing up against tyranny, right? So we've seen that in the Catholic opposition to the Soviet Union, to the communist regime in Poland. So in the Cold War, we've seen that in the civil rights movement in the US, which had religious leaders. In the Muslim world too, there are religious scholars who speak truth to power. And I think there are contributions to those societies, not a problem in those societies.
Yeah, no, I think within Islam, and then go to Annelle, but within Islam, I'm thinking of figures like Khalid Abul Fadl, who, really uses Islam as a way to push for more liberalism, push for democracy. We may differ on, what our conceptualizations of democracy are, but Khalid Abul Fadl, uses...
He's a professor in
UCLA.
Originally from Egypt.
Yes, and, he, in particular, highlights how Islam was never supposed to be a tyrannical force. It was supposed to always push for justice and equality. So he tries to flip the script a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Any other? Yes, sir.
Really quick.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, to your point, I think that the premise of the question first has, again, this sort of like Eurocentric bias, this view that sort of like the way that the state sort of asserted control over religion is the narrative we're told, although in many ways that wasn't necessarily the case in Europe either. But furthermore, just again, sort of this notion that religion can have a single causal effect is fairly nonsensical, although again, that is the underlying assumption of so much of this sort of association between like Islam and terrorism, for example. Whereas in actually understanding whether it's Islam or Hinduism, Christianity, it would seem nonsensical for someone to come out and say, well, this person's Christian, so clearly they're going to be violent. It's like you can't, certainly there are aspects of the Christian tradition that could lead one to that assumption, but many other aspects that you could point to saying, no, this religion is not about violence, it's about peace. And so Islam is the same. But the fact that sort of assumption prevails, again, reiterates sort of this lack of understanding of what Islam is.
Yeah. Thank you, Annelle. It's often the state is the problem rather than the religion, and religion becomes a problem when it is the doctrine of an oppressive state. Thank you. Sir, you had a question? Thank you. We have a question here in the front.
The question was for Annelle.
Could you please also identify yourself
Sorry.
just for the purpose of the panel?
My name is Anwar Khan. I'm from Spark Consulting. I did 30 years in humanitarian and international philanthropic work. We saw the effects of tyranny. People are hungry. We were talking about freedom. There's not just freedom to speak. There's freedom to eat and freedom to drink. You don't have much freedom if you can't eat or drink. So we saw the effects of bad policies across the Middle East and Muslim world. I'm one of the co-founders of Islamic Relief USA. So my point was for Annelle. You were talking about people who, in the name of interfaith, are taking away religious freedom of others. Not just religious freedom of minorities, but religious freedom of majorities as well. So I'd like, if you could, all of you, if you could, to talk about that a little bit further. I think especially in this town, we need to be more aware of people's agendas when they're talking about interfaith work, and I've been doing it for decades. But there's some people have agendas, and if you try to speak out, they call you a terrorist. If they don't like you, you're a terrorist, and then especially in this town, nobody wants to be your friend, and you're told to leave the meeting.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Annelle, would you like to?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think that's a huge point, freedom to eat. I mean, freedom to survive is a more fundamental need and freedom than freedom to speak or associate. So I certainly agree with your point there. And this is part of what people were calling for in the context of the Arab Spring. It was bread and justice. It wasn't necessarily democracy they were demanding. But this ability to survive and take care of themselves and their families. I do think, your point about, and this is a huge part of what Jon's book does, is sort of holding up the notion of interfaith dialogue, in particular something that the UAE has really excelled at. And again, this does get back to some of these sort of underlying assumptions, which are very Eurocentric or sort of American-centric, which has to do with sort of the treatment of religious minorities, which is seen as something that Europe itself had to really grapple with. Obviously thinking about like the case of the Holocaust, but throughout European history, the Protestant Reformation, a history of violence across ethnic lines, religious ethnic lines. In contrast to the ways that so many of these states restrict the religious freedom of the majority of the people who ostensibly practice the faith that that state is involved in promoting. As Jon was mentioning, it's not only sort of members of the religious establishment, but it is infused through education. I mean, these are states where Islam is the religion of the state, and the state is involved in sort of spreading it. And the ways that it is spread delegitimize alternative expressions, and those alternative expressions, if they do emerge, are characterized as extremist or having a potential for extremism or violence. So again, this does get back to sort of what I was saying about how the way the United States, I think in our efforts to promote religious freedom, is missing the point, or sort of looking at the wrong ways in which states are perhaps like in Saudi Arabia, they've done a remarkable job of reforming textbooks, for example. There used to be various, references to Christians or Jews that were problematic, were seen as potentially leading to extremism or antipathy towards those groups. And MBS, to his credit, has been involved in significant reforms there, but there's been very little discussion of, well, as a Muslim citizen of Saudi Arabia, if I want to sort of express my religion in this way, if the state doesn't like it, that person's probably going to jail, which has a much bigger impact for the vast majority of Saudi citizens than, in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the history of what Saudi Arabia has contributed to in terms of extremism around the region and around the world is also a separate issue to be addressed. But as you said, that has gotten a lot of attention, and these other ways that the state is preventing actual religious freedom are often ignored.
To go off that, I agree, because I think there's this tendency in the West to adopt this like clash of civilizations kind of worldview. It's, Muslims clash with Christians who clash with, X, Y, and Z. But we often don't look within the communities themselves. So when we see things like the Marrakesh Declaration, it's good because, it talks about respect for minorities. But oftentimes the most repressed voices, whether it be particularly in Islam and the Middle East, are Muslims, or the majority who exist throughout the region who happen to espouse a different conceptualization of religious or political authority, and then you're immediately thrown in jail. So I think it's kind of missing the forest for the trees at certain times.
Thank you, Jon. And I agree with you. I think everyone wants freedom for themselves. Every religious community wants freedom for its own religion or sect, or even its particular movement within the sect. The question is, do you want it for everyone? And would you principally, stand for it for everyone? I think that's the difference between people who just want it for themselves and others who believe in it. Like, that's what makes people liberal or libertarian, I think, or an advocate of religious freedom. Now, in the United States, I think there are genuine advocates of religious freedom who argue religious freedom for Christians and Muslims and anyone, and freedom from religion too. That also includes in that people who are secular. They have all the right to live their lives as they choose. But some people, yes, can on religious freedom and also freedom of speech as well. There are people who are like, we don't have freedom of speech. We want to say this, and yes, they should, definitely. But when the issue changes on some other issues, they say, oh, no, there's no place for this here, and so on and so forth. So I think it becomes so ridiculous at some point. How can you ask for freedom of speech here, but then totally change that? But this happens, unfortunately. That's why it's important to bring those experiences together. Like, look, you are asking for this for yourself. How do you want to ban Muslim mosques or hijabs if you want to have churches freely? And what is most tragic is that I've heard voices in the left, or in Europe these days, they're saying, oh, Christians are not free to evangelize in Saudi Arabia or Iran, so let's ban Qurans in Europe. Like, I would bring Western standards to there rather than bringing those standards to the West, but there are some people who seriously argue for that. Of course, that is also joined by perceptions of threats. Oh, these people are here, they're going to take over our society, they're proliferating. I would recommend our friends who define themselves as Western, who are living in the Western civilization, and to remember that threats to Western freedom doesn't always come from outside. it sometimes comes from within, and with the argument of protecting the West from those threats. The best example is McCarthyism. Communism was a threat to freedom in the whole world, to the US itself. But McCarthyism was at times a bigger threat in America itself against free speech, against people having different political opinions and expressing that. Today, there are people who are giving a similar, I think, why regarding Islam or radical Islam or political Islamism. They would say, oh, Islamism is a threat. Islamist parties and movements can be authoritarian. Some of them are violent. That is a threat. That's a problem. But they would then say, that's why let's ban Islamic organizations. Let's ban hijabs. There are people who say, let's ban the Quran. I mean, in Europe, to become a Dutch politician. I mean, that's book banning. That's kind of all the way towards Nazism. I mean, it's going that direction. So that is also a major problem. And I think principled defense of these values is exactly what we need, therefore. Thank you. Any other question from the audience? Yes, please. Preeta, right?
Hi. You all have sort of
Please,
talked.
can you identify yourself? Yes.
Yes. My name is Preeti Kulkarni, and I'm an intern this semester.
At the Cato Institute, yeah.
Yes. You all have talked about how religion can be used to establish norms in opposition to fascism, socialism, or other ideologies. How do you think we can best emphasize this compatibility in practice? Do you think it would be helpful to emphasize it as in terms of like big R religion encompassing all of them? Or do you think it's more so in the context of individual ones, like emphasizing the value of Islam in compatibility with liberalism, or yeah?
Would you like to?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question.
So can you paraphrase the question maybe?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the compatibility between religion and how it can be used to establish norms, should we emphasize how religion in general could be used to establish those norms, or more specifically, Islam, Hinduism, depending on the context?
Well, in every society, when you say religion, it automatically translates into something. And in America, it's very diverse and you have a million religions. But if you speak in Konya, in the middle of Turkey, when you say religion, they will automatically think of Islam. Or, I don't know, in Honduras, probably they will think of Catholicism. Or in India, it could be Islam or Hinduism. But I think America is a special place. One of the many reasons that I think makes it great is this religious diversity. And there are many branches of Christianity, other religions, Judaism, Islam, and you know, New Age religions and everything, Baha'ism and all. So in that sense, there's more interfaith discussion in the literal sense of a term that, you know, what we say here, what you say on that. In most other societies, you have a little bit more monochrome, you know, sense of religion. So if you're in Serbia, you might have a conversation about Orthodox Christianity when you say religions, which means I think in every religious tradition, you have a need for and a room for fostering the values towards freedom and tolerance and pluralism and respect and you know, non-coercion. You have the alternative approaches in every tradition, right? Religion also can become a vehicle for nationalism, which is a big dynamic we're seeing in India. We've seen in the Balkans. We're seeing in Israel. We're seeing on the Palestinians. I think religion becomes the battle cry of this particular group, which has a claim for a land or for a cause or for a grand ambition to create something greater, an empire, and so on and so forth. And then that makes religion generally get ugly, right? It becomes the vehicle for the passions and the hatreds of one group. It is at its best when within that group it calls for dignity, compassion, understanding, and freedom for all. Any other last-minute question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Vikram. I'm also an intern at the Cato Institute. My question was about natural resources. Do you think that some people have said that because Middle Eastern countries and the most authoritarian ones derive a lot of their state revenues from fixed resources like oil or minerals or natural gas, that it's structurally harder to have liberal institutions as those countries? Do you think that's reductionist? Do you think there's some accuracy to that? What's your take on that?
No, so like the question of the rentier state model is pretty prevalent, you know, when talking about the Middle East, specifically when talking about the Gulf. In terms of the rentier state model and how it relates specifically to religion, I don't know if I could draw like a direct causal link there. But I think, the rentier state model in and of itself, the idea that the government, derives its wealth from a resource that is not through its citizens, so it can, it doesn't tax its citizens, it kind of represses them while it generates its revenue elsewhere, in many cases has been a recipe for illiberalism. But I think, especially in the 3 Gulf states, I think this rentier model is also being pretty challenged and reformed in a lot of ways. You have like the Vision 2030 models, whether or not they work is something else. But there is an effort to transition away from this rentier state model. But this is reforming economics without reforming politics. They still try to be incredibly authoritarian, incredibly repressive. So I don't think whether it's if they get it from oil, if they get it from investments or golf or other sports, or like entertainment, like Saudi Arabia has really done. I think it's the political systems that really need to be reformed at the end of the day. And here at Cato, we're very skeptical of the state. So that would mean less power in the hands of the state, more in the power of the citizenry.
Wonderful. Yeah. You would like to add something now? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, we're almost about to finish. I agreed a lot with you on 2 more things. John, I said on Tunisia. Tunisia was the most promising thing that has happened in the region in the 2010s. Unfortunately, it took a terrible authoritarian turn, which must be renounced and condemned, and the political imprisonments there has to be condemned. I hope Tunisia can come back to its democratic path. Finally, Syria has shown us that history is not over, right? Some people thought that Arab Spring it's done, finished, no problem, all the dictators are back. Well, no, they're fragile. And we've seen that the worst of the worst, Bashar Assad, has fallen, thank God, I should say, and thanks in the name of liberty. So change is possible towards freedom, and we should keep working for it. Thank you so much, John, for this great book.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thank you.
Annelle, thank you. It was a great panel. Thank you. Please join upstairs for lunch. Thank you.